The heavy glass doors of the Grand Meridian swung open, letting in a sharp gust of the biting New York City wind. Kenji Sato stepped into the lobby, his boots leaving faint, damp prints on the perfectly polished white marble. He shifted the weight of the heavy steel toolbox in his right hand, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulder that came from a 12-hour shift. His utility jacket was faded at the elbows, and a smudge of graphite traced a line across his jaw, marking him as a man who worked for a living in a building where most people simply collected dividends. He didn't mind the work, but today the air felt different. The lobby was filled with the cloying, artificial scent of expensive lilies and the kind of silence that only extreme wealth can buy. Marcus, the young doorman, caught Kenji's eye and gave a small, respectful nod. He liked Kenji. Kenji was the only contractor who ever bothered to ask about Marcus's daughter or offer him a coffee on the way in. But as Kenji approached the elevators, Marcus's posture stiffened. The rhythmic, sharp clicking of high heels echoed from the concierge desk, a sound like a metronome counting down to a disaster. Brenda Montgomery was rounding the corner, her blonde hair coiffed into a rigid helmet of perfection, a tiny, trembling poodle tucked under one arm like a designer accessory. She was draped in a cream-colored cashmere coat that probably cost more than Kenji's truck, and her eyes were already narrowed in disgust before she even reached the elevator bank. Kenji reached out a calloused hand to press the button for the penthouse, but Brenda's voice sliced through the air like a razor blade. She didn't ask him to stop, she commanded the space around her. She asked him if he had any idea what the word service meant, her voice dripping with a casual, practiced cruelty. She pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the building, her diamond rings catching the light of the chandelier. She told him that the freight elevator was in the alley where he belonged, claiming that his very presence was contaminating the air for the residents who actually paid to be there. Kenji took a slow, steady breath, refusing to let his temper flare. He explained as calmly as possible that there was a critical gas leak on the 64th floor and that every second wasted was a safety risk for everyone in the building, including her. He told her the freight elevator was currently being used for a move-in and that he had been cleared by building management to use the express lift. He stepped toward the open doors of the elevator, his boots making a dull thud against the floor. Brenda's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She couldn't believe this man, this laborer, was talking back to her. She stepped directly into his path, her chest heaving with indignation. She asked him who he thought he was talking to, screaming that her father had built this city while his people were probably still washing dishes in the basement. Marcus took a tentative step forward, his voice trembling as he tried to intervene, but Brenna snapped at him to shut up if he wanted to keep his job through the afternoon. The tension in the lobby became a physical weight. Kenji stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the elevator doors. He told her he was just doing his job. That was the breaking point. Brenda's eyes went wide, her nostrils flaring as she leaned in close enough for Kenji to smell the expensive wine on her breath. Without a word of warning, she pulled back and spat directly into Kenji's face. The sound of the impact was sickeningly loud in the quiet lobby. A thick, warm glob of saliva slid down Kenji's cheek, catching on the collar of his utility jacket. Time seemed to fracture. Marcus gasped, his hand flying to his mouth in horror. Brenda didn't look ashamed, she looked triumphant. She stood there with a smug, twisted smile, her chin held high as if she had just performed a public service. She told him that now he finally had something on him that was worth more than his entire life. Kenji didn't move, he didn't swing his toolbox, and he didn't shout. He simply stood there, the weight of 30 years of hidden history pressing down on his shoulders. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, white rag, slowly wiping the moisture from his face with a steady hand. He looked Brenda directly in the eyes, his expression so cold and so hollow that for the first time in her life, the socialite felt a shiver of genuine fear. He told her that she had no idea what she had just started. As he turned to walk back toward the entrance, leaving the elevator for her, his mind wasn't on the insult. It was on the deed to the land this building sat on, and the fact that by tomorrow morning, Brenda Montgomery wouldn't have a floor left to spit on. The memory hit Kenji like a physical blow, the pristine marble of the lobby dissolving into the grainy, flickering reality of 30 years ago. He could almost smell it now, not the expensive lilies of the Meridian, but the sharp, comforting scent of pickled ginger, ripe citrus, and the faint, toasted aroma of roasted sesame seeds. He was 15 again, standing behind the counter of Sato's Fine Foods, a small but vibrant grocery store nestled in a corner of the city that the world had forgotten. His father, Hiroshi, was there beside him, his hands moving with a rhythmic grace as he polished an apple before placing it atop a pyramid of fruit. Hiroshi had worked 3 jobs for a decade to buy that single storefront, and to him, it wasn't just a business, it was a flag planted in the soil of a new country. The bell above the door had chirped, but the man who walked in didn't bring the usual neighborhood warmth. Charles Montgomery stepped onto the linoleum floor with the kind of heavy, arrogant stride that suggested he already owned the air he was breathing. He was followed by a teenage girl, a younger, sharper version of the woman who had just spat in Kenji's face. Even then, Brenda had that same habit of looking at everything as if it were covered in grease. She had stood by the door, checking her gold watch and sighing with a dramatic, performative boredom while her father slapped a thick manila envelope onto the counter. Charles didn't ask for a price. He told Hiroshi that the neighborhood was changing, that progress was coming, and that a tiny, ethnic grocery store was a blight on the vision he had for a new luxury skyline. He offered a pittance for the land, hardly enough to cover a year's rent elsewhere. Kenji remembered how his father had stood tall, his voice steady and polite as he refused, explaining that this store was his son's future. Charles Montgomery hadn't argued, he had simply looked around the shop, his eyes landing on a hand-drawn blueprint Kenji's father had pinned to the wall. A dream of one day expanding the shop into a grand community center. Charles had let out a short, mocking laugh, whispered that some people just didn't know their place, and walked out. A week later, the dream turned to ash. Kenji woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of roaring wind, only to realize the sound was coming from inside the building. The orange tongues of flame licked the ceiling, devouring the wooden shelves and the carefully stacked cans. He remembered the heat searing his lungs and the way his father had screamed, not in pain, but in grief, as the fire department arrived too late to save anything but the scorched foundation. The police report called it an electrical fault, but Kenji had seen the black car idling at the end of the block that night. The loss broke Hiroshi. Within 6 months, the man who had survived a war and an ocean crossing surrendered to a quiet, hollow despair. He died in a cramped, gray apartment, leaving Kenji with nothing but a folded, singed piece of paper, the original blueprint for the grand building Hiroshi had hoped to build. For the next 3 years, the subway became Kenji's bedroom. He learned to sleep sitting up on the L train, clutching his backpack to his chest, his fingers often tracing the lines of that blueprint through the fabric. He spent his days in public libraries, teaching himself the language of stone, steel, and finance, fueled by a cold, quiet fire that no developer could ever extinguish. Back in the present, Kenji stood in the shadow of the Grand Meridian's towering entrance, his eyes tracing the massive gold logo etched into the glass above the door. It was a stylized, modern M, sleek and expensive. But as he looked at it, he saw the truth that no one else in the city knew. He tilted his head, mentally flipping the logo and smoothing out the aggressive edges. It wasn't an M. It was the exact, unique S his father had hand-drawn on that blueprint 30 years ago. The Montgomerys hadn't just stolen the land, they had stolen the very soul of his father's dream, twisting it into a monument for their own vanity. A cold smirk tugged at the corner of Kenji's mouth as he adjusted his toolbox. Brenda thought she was protecting her castle from a common intruder, but she was actually locking herself in with the man who owned the keys. The repairman she had just humiliated wasn't there to fix a leak. He was there to perform an autopsy on her father's stolen legacy. He turned his back on the building, the wetness on his cheek finally dry, and disappeared into the New York crowd. The storm hadn't just begun, it had been brewing for 3 decades, and the first lightning strike was about to hit the penthouse. Brenda didn't stop at the spit. It was as if that single, vile act had cracked open a dam of long-repressed malice, and now she was drowning in her own need to destroy him. She snatched her rose gold iPhone from her designer bag with a hand that trembled not with fear, but with the sheer adrenaline of power. She held the phone up like a weapon, the lens pointed directly at Kenji's face, which remained unnervingly still. She began to shriek into the device, her voice rising to a pitch that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the lobby. She told her followers, and anyone within a 3-block radius, that she was being assaulted. She cried out that a dangerous, deranged trespasser in a fake uniform had cornered her in the elevator and threatened her life. The performance was chillingly seamless. Within seconds, the lobby began to fill with other residents who had been drawn out by the commotion. High-ranking executives in silk ties and women in yoga gear that cost more than a month of Kenji's rent peered over the mezzanine railing, their faces twisting into the same collective expression of suspicion. They didn't see a man who had come to save the building from a gas leak. They saw exactly what Brenda wanted them to see. They saw a threat. They saw a man who didn't belong in their sanctuary of glass and gold. Kenji looked around the circle of judging eyes, his heart sinking not for himself, but for the world they lived in. He saw Marcus, the doorman, standing by the heavy brass doors, his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. Marcus knew the truth. He had seen the spit. He had seen the provocation. But as Brenda turned her venomous gaze toward him, screaming for him to tell the truth to the 911 operator, Marcus looked at the floor. He thought of his daughter's tuition and the 3 decades he had left on his mortgage, and he remained silent. The isolation was total. Kenji stood in the center of the marble floor, a man alone in a room full of people, framed for a crime he didn't commit by a woman who wouldn't even look him in the eye. Among the crowd, a woman in a sharp, navy blue city inspector's jacket moved quietly toward the back. This was Sarah, Kenji's most trusted assistant, though to everyone else, she looked like just another bureaucrat checking a clipboard. She didn't speak. She didn't intervene. She caught Kenji's eye for a fraction of a second, her expression a mix of fury and a silent question. "Do we end this now?" Kenji gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. He wasn't ready to reveal his hand. He needed Brenda to go all the way. He needed her to believe, with every fiber of her being, that she had won. The sirens arrived within minutes, their red and blue lights strobing against the lobby's glass and washing the marble in the colors of an emergency. 2 officers burst through the doors, their hands hovering near their holsters. Brenda didn't wait for them to ask questions. She ran toward them, her voice cracking in a mock sob that would have won an Oscar if it weren't so transparent. She pointed at Kenji, claiming he had tried to rob her, that he had lunged at her, and that she had only survived because she managed to push him away. One of the officers, a rookie with a jawline like a brick and eyes full of unearned certainty, didn't even look at Kenji's credentials which were clipped to his belt. He didn't ask for his side of the story. He simply saw a wealthy woman in distress and a man in a work jacket. He grabbed Kenji's arm, twisting it painfully behind his back. The cold, heavy bite of the steel handcuffs ratcheted shut around Kenji's wrists, the sound of the clicking metal echoing through the silent room like a gavel. Up on the balcony, Mr. Henderson, the most senior member of the building's board, watched the scene while clutching a thick leather folder. He knew Brenda was lying. He had been watching the security feed on his tablet from the gym. But he also knew that Brenda's father had covered up his own embezzlement 10 years ago. He stood there, a silent witness to the injustice, weighing his soul against his bank account. He chose the latter, closing his folder and turning away as the police began to lead Kenji toward the exit. As Kenji was escorted through the lobby, his head held high despite the hands shoving him forward, Brenda leaned in close one last time. The police were busy clearing a path through the gawking residents, and for a moment, they were in a private bubble of noise. She whispered that she told him she'd have him removed like the trash he was. She told him to enjoy his cell, because by the time she was done with her lawyers, he'd never see the sun again. Kenji didn't blink. He just looked at her with a calm, pitying smile that seemed to infuriate her more than any insult could. He was being taken away in a patrol car, but as the doors slammed shut, his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating the exact moment Brenda's world would begin to turn into the very cage she thought she was putting him in. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct hummed with a headache-inducing buzz, casting a sickly yellow glow over the gray concrete walls of the holding cell. Kenji sat on the hard metal bench, his hands still loosely clasped where the cuffs had been just moments before. To the tired desk sergeant and the board officers walking past, he was just another face from a street squabble, a man whose life had likely peaked and stalled in a utility jacket. But Kenji wasn't looking at the bars or the peeling paint. He was looking at his hands, the same hands that had once scrubbed subway floors and now signed billion-dollar contracts. He wasn't a victim of Brenda Montgomery's malice, he was the witness to her final act of self-destruction. The heavy steel door at the end of the hallway groaned open, and Sarah walked in. She had discarded the city inspector's windbreaker for a sharp, charcoal gray blazer that screamed authority. She didn't look like an assistant, she looked like an executioner. The rookie officer who had arrested Kenji tried to stop her, his hand reaching for his belt, but Sarah simply held up a leather-bound folder and a tablet. She spoke in a voice that was quiet, cold, and utterly terrifying in its precision, telling the officer that he had exactly 60 seconds to process her client's release or he would be spending the next decade of his career in a legal nightmare he couldn't imagine. She stepped up to the bars, sliding the tablet through the narrow gap. On the screen was a scrolling feed of forensic accounting, red lines of debt and flagged transactions that spelled the end of the Montgomery dynasty. Brenda had been living a lie. Her family's estate was a hollow shell, and to keep up the appearance of the Queen of the Meridian, she had been systematically embezzling millions from the building's homeowners association. Sarah leaned in, her voice a low murmur that didn't reach the guards. She told Kenji that it was worse than they thought. Brenda's father had used the building as a massive money laundering front before he died, and Brenda had been frantically trying to cover the holes in the ledger. Kenji looked at the data, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. This was the moment most men would have felt a surge of petty triumph, but Kenji only felt a deep, resonant sense of completion. He tapped a single icon on the tablet, bringing up a legal document titled Notice of Immediate Foreclosure. He had purchased the building's defaulted mezzanine debt months ago through a series of anonymous shell companies. With a single digital signature, he wasn't just a contractor anymore. He was the landlord. He was the owner of the very air Brenda Montgomery breathed. He signed his name, Kenji Sato, CEO of Sato Global, and handed the tablet back to Sarah. He told her to let Brenda have her gala, to let her invite every influential person in the city, and to let her believe she had finally crushed the man from the lobby. He wanted her at the very peak of her arrogance before the ground vanished beneath her feet. The rookie officer returned, his face pale and his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys to the cell. He had just seen the high-definition footage Sarah had uploaded to the precinct's server, the footage from the Meridian's hidden security suite that Kenji himself had installed. It showed the entire encounter in crystal clear detail, the verbal abuse, Brenda blocking the elevator, and the clear, undeniable moment she spat in Kenji's face. There was no assault by Kenji. There was only a hate crime committed by a socialite. The officer muttered a panicked apology, his voice cracking as he swung the cell door open. He asked Kenji why he didn't say who he was at the scene. Kenji stood up, smoothing out his utility jacket and picking up his toolbox. He looked at the officer with a calm, piercing gaze that made the younger man take a step back. He told him that if he had told them who he was, they would have treated him with respect because of his money, but he wanted to see how they treated him when they thought he had none. He walked out of the precinct into the cool night air, the red and blue lights of the city reflecting in his eyes. He wasn't the repairman anymore, and he wasn't the victim. He was the architect of a justice 30 years in the making, and the blueprint for Brenda's downfall was now perfectly in place. As he climbed into the back of the black sedan Sarah had waiting, he didn't look back at the station. He was already looking toward the ballroom of the Grand Meridian, imagining the look on Brenda's face when she realized that the trash she had tried to sweep away was actually the foundation of her entire world. The heavy glass doors of the boutique swung shut behind Marcus with a hushed, expensive-sounding click, immediately swallowing the roar of the city traffic. He stood on the plush cream carpet, feeling the sudden chill of the high-powered air conditioning seep through his thin, faded hoodie. He adjusted his grip on the strap of his backpack, his palms slightly damp. He wasn't here for himself. He was here to buy the one thing his daughter had asked for after a year of straight as. But as he took a step forward, the atmosphere in the room shifted. It wasn't the temperature that made him shiver, it was the sudden, suffocating silence of the two sales associates standing behind the marble counter. One of them, a woman with hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her eyes into a permanent expression of disdain, didn't even look up from her tablet at first. She just sniffed, a sharp, practiced sound that signaled her disapproval before she even processed his face. Her name tag read Tiffany, and she wore a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. When she finally did deign to look at him, her gaze didn't meet his eyes. Instead, it traveled slowly, agonizingly, from his scuffed sneakers to the frayed hem of his jeans, finally landing on the small, crumpled piece of paper in his hand where he'd written down the specific model of the watch. "Can I help you find the exit?" Tiffany asked, her voice dripping with a sugary, fake politeness that felt like a slap. She didn't move from behind the counter. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply stood there, her arms folded across her chest, acting as a human barrier between Marcus and the glittering glass cases. Marcus tried to summon a smile, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He held up the paper, his voice steady despite the heat rising in his neck. "I'm looking for the rose gold edition with the leather strap," he said. "I saw it online and wanted to see it in person before making the purchase." Tiffany let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like breaking glass. She turned to her colleague, a younger man who was busy pretending to straighten a display of silk scarves. "Did you hear that, Julian? He wants to see the rose gold edition." She turned back to Marcus, her eyes narrowing into slits. "Honey, let's be realistic. That piece is a limited edition. It's for our serious clients. Not for people who just wandered in off the street to use the air conditioning. Maybe there's a department store down the block that has something more in your price bracket." Marcus felt the familiar sting of it, that old, heavy weight of being judged before he'd even opened his mouth. He thought about the double shifts he'd pulled at the warehouse, the missed dinners, and the way he'd carefully tucked away every extra dollar into an envelope hidden under his mattress. He wasn't just a guy in a hoodie, he was a father who had promised his little girl the world. "I have the money," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming firmer. "I'd like to see the watch, please." Tiffany's face transformed. The fake smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated coldness. She stepped around the counter, her high heels clicking aggressively on the floor like a ticking clock. "Do not raise your voice with me," she hissed, leaning in so close he could smell her cloying, floral perfume. "I know exactly what you're doing. You come in here, you look around, you wait for us to get distracted, and then something goes missing. I've seen your type 1,000 times. I am not opening that case for you, and I am certainly not letting you touch anything in this store. Now, you can leave on your own, or I can call mall security and have them escort you out in front of everyone. The choice is yours, but you're done wasting my time." She stood there, defiant, her hand hovering near the phone on the counter as if she were daring him to stay. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the emptiness behind the expensive makeup and the arrogance. He looked down at the crumpled paper in his hand, then back at the glass case where the watch sat, shimmering under the spotlights. He realized then that no matter how much money he had in his pocket, he would never be enough for someone who chose to see only the surface. The silence in the boutique felt heavy, expectant, like the air before a storm, as Marcus realized the next move wasn't about the watch anymore. It was about the dignity he refused to leave on that cream-colored carpet. Tiffany's hand was already hovering over the telephone on the marble countertop, her manicured finger poised to dial security with a sense of triumphant malice. Marcus stood his ground, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he didn't move toward the door. The tension in the store was thick enough to choke on, a suffocating mix of expensive air freshener and raw, unmasked prejudice. Just as Tiffany began to press the first digit, the heavy glass doors at the front of the boutique hummed open once more. A tall man in a charcoal gray bespoke suit stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding the room. He didn't look at the watches, he looked straight at the scene unfolding near the counter. Tiffany's entire demeanor performed a violent U-turn. Her lips stopped curling, and the sneer vanished, replaced instantly by a wide, sycophantic grin that looked painful. She yanked her hand away from the phone as if it had burned her. "Mr. Sterling," she chirped, her voice jumping an entire octave into a register of desperate flattery. "We weren't expecting you until the quarterly review next week. Please, excuse the atmosphere. I was just dealing with a bit of a security issue." The man, Mr. Sterling, didn't smile back. He walked slowly toward them, the rhythmic thud of his Italian leather loafers echoing against the walls. He stopped right next to Marcus, who was still holding that crumpled piece of paper like a lifeline. Tiffany shot Marcus a look of pure venom, a silent command to get out before he ruined her reputation in front of the owner. "You heard me," she whispered harshly, leaning across the counter while keeping her face tilted toward the boss. "Leave, now, before things get ugly for you." Mr. Sterling looked at the paper in Marcus's hand, then at Tiffany's flushed, angry face. "Is there a problem here, Tiffany?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Tiffany let out a forced, high-pitched giggle, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Oh, no real problem, sir. Just a misunderstanding. This gentleman was just leaving. He seemed to have wandered into the wrong store, looking for things he clearly can't afford. I was just protecting the brand's integrity. You know how it is. We can't have the showroom looking like a bus station." Marcus felt the heat of humiliation radiating off his skin, but before he could speak, Mr. Sterling reached out and gently took the crumpled paper from his hand. He smoothed it out against the marble, reading the handwritten model number of the rose gold watch. Then, he looked at Marcus's face, searching his eyes with a piercing intensity. Tiffany continued to ramble in the background, her voice growing more frantic. "I even offered to direct him to the clearance outlets at the edge of town, sir. I was being more than generous given his attitude." "Is that so?" Mr. Sterling interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "Because from where I was standing outside the window, it looked like you were threatening to call the police on a customer who was asking to see a specific piece. A piece that, if I recall, we have exactly one of in the back safe." Tiffany's smile flickered and died. Her eyes darted between the two men, the first hint of genuine fear beginning to cloud her expression. "But sir, look at him. He's wearing a hoodie. He doesn't have a profile in our system. I was just following the protocol for suspicious behavior." Mr. Sterling leaned in, his shadow falling over her. "The protocol, Tiffany, is to treat every person who walks through those doors with the same level of dignity you would show me." He turned to Marcus, his expression softening into something resembling deep, sincere regret. "Marcus, I am incredibly sorry for the way you've been treated in my establishment today. It is completely unacceptable." He then turned back to Tiffany, his voice turning back to ice. "And as for you, you're right about one thing. This store does have a reputation to protect. But the threat to our integrity isn't the man standing in front of the counter. It's the person standing behind it." The color drained from Tiffany's face so fast she looked like she might faint. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out. Mr. Sterling didn't give her a chance to recover. "You can head to the back and gather your things," he said calmly. "Your employment here is terminated, effective immediately. We'll mail your final check. Julian, please come over here and assist this gentleman with the rose gold edition. And make sure it's wrapped for a gift. It's on the house." Tiffany stood frozen, her world collapsing in the span of 30 seconds. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him this time, but the power dynamic had shifted entirely. Marcus wasn't a trespasser anymore, he was the guest of honor, and she was the one being cast out into the cold. He watched her shoulders slump as she turned and walked toward the back room, the clicking of her heels now sounding hollow and defeated. Marcus took a deep breath, the weight on his chest finally lifting, replaced by a surge of quiet, powerful triumph that tasted better than any luxury watch ever could. The cool evening air felt different on Marcus's skin as he stepped out of the boutique, the heavy weight of the gold-embossed shopping bag swinging gently against his leg. He walked toward the bus stop, but his mind was already miles away, inside the small, two-bedroom apartment where his daughter, Maya, was likely hunched over her textbooks. He thought about the countless nights he had sat at the kitchen table, the yellow light of the overhead bulb flickering, as he meticulously sorted through crumpled $5 bills and a jar of silver coins. He remembered the dull ache in his lower back after 12-hour shifts at the shipping docks and the way he had learned to ignore the growl of his own stomach just to make sure her college fund grew by a few more dollars each week. When he reached home, the scent of boxed macaroni and cheese met him at the door, a humble smell that stood in stark contrast to the cloying, expensive perfumes of the mall. Maya looked up from the sofa, her glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice tired but bright. "You're late. I saved you some dinner." Marcus didn't say a word. He simply walked over and placed the velvet-lined bag on the coffee table in front of her. Maya's eyes widened, tracking the elegant logo on the side of the bag. "Dad? What is this?" "We talked about saving for the car repairs." Marcus sat down beside her, the worn springs of the sofa groaning under his weight. "Open it," he whispered. As she pulled the ribbon, the rose gold watch caught the light of their modest living room, glowing with a brilliance that seemed to illuminate the entire space. It wasn't just a timepiece, it was a physical manifestation of every sacrifice he had made, every insult he had swallowed, and every mile he had walked in those scuffed sneakers. Maya's breath hitched in her throat, her fingers trembling as she touched the leather strap. "It's the one from the window," she breathed, her eyes welling with tears. "But Dad, this is too much. You worked so hard." He took her hand in his rough, calloused palm a map of a lifetime of manual labor. "Maya, today I was reminded that there are people in this world who will look at your clothes or your bank account and think they know who you are," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "They'll try to tell you where you belong and what you're worth. But they don't see the heart. They don't see the brilliance. I didn't buy this because of the price tag. I bought it because I never want you to look at a beautiful thing and feel like you don't belong in the room with it. You're worth more than any diamond or gold they have in that store." Maya leaned her head on his shoulder, the tears finally spilling over as she hugged him tightly. The watch sat on the table, a shimmering reminder that while the world might judge by the surface, true value is forged in the fire of struggle and the quiet dignity of a father's love. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace. The humiliation of the afternoon had faded into a distant shadow, replaced by the warmth of his daughter's gratitude. He realized then that justice wasn't just about a rude clerk losing her job. It was about the moment a man who had been told he was nothing proved to his daughter that they were everything. They sat there in the quiet of the evening, two people who owned very little, yet in that moment, felt like they owned the world. 6 months had passed since that afternoon in the boutique, but the crisp morning air felt lighter now as Marcus pulled his car into a parking spot he never thought he would occupy. He wasn't wearing the faded hoodie today, instead, he straightened the collar of a sharp navy blazer, his reflection in the rearview mirror showing a man whose eyes had finally lost that permanent shadow of exhaustion. He stepped out and looked up at the towering glass facade of Sterling Enterprises. This wasn't a delivery drop-off or a janitorial shift. He was walking through the front doors as the newly appointed logistics coordinator, a position Mr. Sterling had offered after seeing the meticulous way Marcus had managed his own meager finances and the quiet integrity he had displayed under fire. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and light, much like the store, but this time Marcus didn't hesitate at the threshold. The receptionist offered a genuine, warm smile as he passed, her greeting lacking even a hint of the suspicion that had once defined his every interaction with the world of the wealthy. As he headed toward the elevators, a familiar sound caught his ear, the sharp, erratic clicking of high heels on stone. He turned to see a woman standing by the security desk, her back to him. She was wearing a cheap, slightly wrinkled polyester suit, and she was arguing with the guard, her voice rising in that shrill, entitled pitch he would recognize anywhere. "I don't care if my name isn't on the list," she snapped, snapping her fingers in the guard's face. "I have an interview for the receptionist position. Do you have any idea how much experience I have in high-end retail? I used to run the floor at the most exclusive boutique in the mall. This is unbelievable. I shouldn't be kept waiting like a common beggar." The guard sighed, his face a mask of bored patience. "Ma'am, if you don't have a scheduled appointment, I can't let you up." Tiffany let out a huff of pure indignation, her shoulders bunching with rage as she adjusted her knockoff handbag. Marcus stopped a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. It was like looking at a ghost of a past life. Tiffany turned around, her face twisted in a sneer, and for a second, her eyes locked onto his. The transformation was instantaneous. The arrogance drained out of her face, replaced by a gray, sickly pallor as she recognized the man she had tried to have arrested. She looked at his tailored blazer, the badge clipped to his belt, and the way the security guard nodded respectfully to him. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, the realization hitting her that the man she had deemed a nobody was now the person who held the keys to the very kingdom she was trying to enter. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't mock her or demand an apology. He simply walked over to the desk, his footsteps quiet and deliberate. "Is there a problem here, officer?" he asked, his voice calm and resonant. The guard shook his head. "Just someone without an appointment, sir." Marcus turned his gaze to Tiffany. She looked smaller now, the venom replaced by a desperate, shivering shame. He remembered the heat of the injustice he had felt that day, but looking at her now, all he felt was a profound, quiet pity. She had spent her whole life building a wall of silk and status, only to find herself trapped on the outside looking in. "You should give her the application form," Marcus said to the guard, his voice devoid of malice. "Everyone deserves a chance to prove they've learned something." He looked Tiffany in the eye one last time, not with the fear of a victim, but with the steady grace of a man who had moved far beyond her reach. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Tiffany. Just remember that the clothes don't make the person. The heart does." He turned and walked toward the elevator, the doors sliding open to welcome him into his new life. As the lift rose, he looked down at the gold watch on his own wrist, a gift from Mr. Sterling on his first day, and smiled, knowing that the greatest victory wasn't in getting even, but in rising so high that the shadows of the past could no longer touch him.